Okay, so we'll make a start. So welcome everybody to our Leeds at COP28 webinar. Before we really get going, there's just a little bit of housekeeping to do. So first of all, we will have a Q&A session a bit later. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screens, to ask questions. And you can also vote for your favourite questions to flag them with the panellists. We'll come back to the questions once all the panellists have had a chance to speak, and we're going to keep you all on mute for now unless we particularly enable you to ask questions. And please note as well, the webinar is being recorded and I think it will appear on the Priestley website very soon. Okay. So what are we going to cover today? So we're going to have a look back at Leeds at COP28, and then we're going to have some reflections from 4 of our delegates who attended COP both in person and online, covering a range of different topics which are very important to the negotiations and also how we move forward in this critical decade for climate action. And then we're going to also doubtless touch on a number of other areas as we go along. As I mentioned as well, we'll have time for Q&A after everyone's spoken. So here we have just an overview of Leeds' participation in COP. We sent 9 people to Dubai in person, and we also had 15 delegates online. This was one of the first COP summits where we had a major online presence, enabling more people to participate in the process, follow events and track negotiations and so on. So Leeds took part and contributed to a number of events across the 2 weeks of COP. There were 16 in total, and as you can see, we covered a range of topics from water to law to health and food systems, and we're going to hear about some of those issues and how they were covered in the negotiations very shortly. I think here it's worth a reminder that the outcomes of COP were, one thing that happened was there was the first agreement to transition away from fossil fuels. That was the first time that was featured in a COP outcome. But the views on the outcome were mixed, with many people saying they didn't go far enough and fast enough. So it'll be really interesting to hear from our panellists about what they thought of that in the context of the topics that they're going to talk about as well. So the first panellist we have coming up, I'm going to ask all panellists to speak in turn and for 5 minutes about their chosen topics and also to introduce themselves as they start. So I'm now going to give the floor to Piers. Piers, the floor is yours on the global stocktake.
Okay, well, it's good to be here, everyone, and thank you for coming to this webinar. My name is Piers Forster. I'm the director of the Priestley Centre, but I was attending the COP conference in my capacity as an intergovernmental panel on climate change scientist, and it was my job to present the IPCC evidence to the delegates. We are one of the only organisations that is able to present this evidence at the COP conference. So that's what I was doing there. And my job today is to give my thoughts on the global stocktake part. So I'll first say what it is. So the whole global stocktake was a whole fun piece of work, and it is an intimate part of the whole Paris Agreement. When that was started in 2016, they introduced this idea of five yearly review mechanism, and this was sort of meant to be the first five yearly review mechanism, and the 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 point behind it is that the whole different countries are supposed to get more ambitious over time. So it is the way that the Paris Agreement does increase ambition over time. And it did start 12 months ago, and it completed at the COP28 conference. And it is really designed to raise ambition in lots of different areas. First, on mitigation, and that's what everybody associates with, this transition away from fossil fuels was the thing that everybody's talking about, but it also had other components too. It also established it tried to push things forward on adaptation, and we had the framework for the global goal on adaptation as well, and that was a significant improvement over where we were before. It also talked about increasing ambition for more financing and loss and damage and other components as well. But perhaps I'll just introduce you to what everyone was talking about, which is the wording on the transition away from fossil fuel. So I'd like to talk a bit about the way these negotiations progressed. I mean, and this whole negotiation about the global stocktake document did really consume a lot of the COP media attention from everyone, and a lot of the debate in the up and down the corridors was all about what's going to be in this document, and a lot of emphasis were on the particular parts of the document that all about this text on the kind of phase out or phase down. And after the first 1 week of technical negotiations, this is where we were. So the different countries, or we call them parties, could not agree on a particular idea. So they had the different options about phasing out, and they also had an option of not having anything at all. Please could go on one more slide too. And it did reach this very tough negotiation where the OPEC countries in particular really tried to push back on this phase out and phase down kind of language. So then we had this text that was proposed by the United Arab Emirates, and this text came out in week 2, and it was universally seen, in fact, as a big kind of watering down of the wording and a complete disaster, just because it did give countries a lot of different policies about what they could or couldn't do, and there really wasn't anything in the wording that was really compelling for countries to take action on their oil and class industries. Can you go on to the next one, please?
Piers, you have 1 minute left.
Okay, good. That's fine. I'm done, Debbie, almost. So then, this with the agreed final wording, and I want to try and convey, I think, that perhaps with our developed country perspective, perhaps it doesn't come across very ambitiously, but I think this is a really big breakthrough in the COP negotiations. It's the first time there's this transition away from the fossil fuel is really talked about, and I think it's really intelligent the way they came up with this final wording, because they really concentrate on things we can do in the next 10 years or in this crucial 2020 decade, that we have to begin to really begin this transition this decade. So we're not so interested in the debate about where we might end up in 20 or 30 years' time. It is really compelling all the countries to act today. Yeah, okay, good. That's me. I'd like to pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you. Richard, would you like to take the floor now?
Yes, thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. Thanks to the organizers of this webinar. And let me just introduce myself. I am Professor of International Relations. I work on politics of climate change, and I'm co-chair of the UNFCCC task force here at the University of Leeds. What I'm going to say is actually going to repeat some of what Piers has said, but with a slightly different angle towards the end. And I think it's worthwhile. There basically were two COPs at COP28. There was a World Trade Fair, which is now larger than Davos, in which there's a great deal that goes on, particularly with regard to the global economy and the transition to clean energy. And a lot can be said there. And there were, and Piers has taken us there immediately, there were the negotiations and the whole climate diplomacy in those negotiations. I'm also going to focus on that. These negotiations formed in large part a political response to the global stocktake. The global stocktake said very clearly in September that we are way off track. We're looking at about 2.7 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. And for example, we emitted 57 gigatons of CO2 and its equivalent in 2022. And what must be mitigated by 2030 is between 22 and 25 gigatons of CO2 and its equivalent. So what did COP28 offer in the context of the global stocktake and its concerns about where we are? And what are the political implications to be drawn from it? I think, and here I am repeating Piers, I think there are 4 outstanding measures in the final outcome, what we are calling what they call the UAE consensus, even though the text, and particularly the outcome response to the global stocktake, it's full of loopholes. For example, that gas is now considered a transitional fuel. Loopholes scatter the text, but there are 4 important outcomes which have been well publicized by the media. Firstly, the trebling of renewables globally. That'll be very uneven. For example, Indonesia, given its energy demands that are going to grow in the next 20 years, probably needs to multiply by a factor of 8 its renewables. So it's an uneven process. The doubling of energy efficiency globally, the requirement that all greenhouse gas emissions are included in the next nationally determined contributions, which is in 2025, therefore the end of this year. As Piers is saying, it's now that action must be taken. And as we know, the transition away from fossil fuels, Piers has put up the text, so I'm not going to read it again. It is a bit of a mealy mouthful. It's clearly a compromise, as Piers was pointing to, among the various parties. And I think, basically, as has been said, it's a first-time mention of fossil fuels in the 28 years of COP history. despite the fact that they contribute between 75 and 90% of greenhouse gases. And as Simon Steer, the executive secretary of the UNFCCC said, this is the beginning of the end of fossil fuel era. The beginning of the end. That is still, as Piers intimated, it is very important what has been said. It is a clear direction of travel, and it is a framework now for action, or a framework to criticize action that is not taken, as has been clear recently with statements by Alok Sharma, Chris Skidmore, and Theresa May with regard to the UK licensing bill. But what was not said is obviously important. The how, the schedule, and the different speeds of the phase out according to country circumstance, particularly the most vulnerable countries, but also those countries that are overly dependent on fossil fuels. All of that was not negotiated. It was clearly too difficult. And international collaboration is clearly required in the coming years around this schedule and the way in which it is done, to go back to the text, a transitioning out that is done with equity in a fair, orderly, and equitable manner.
1 minute left, Richard.
I've got a minute left, right. What must be done then with regard to how much needs to be mitigated? I'll skip a couple of things. Clearly, the focus is again nationally. Despite the international collaboration, the political focus must be on this critical decade. It can't be the 2030s. It has to be this critical decade. We need national strategic visions, national policies and delivery that is 1.5 aligned. And that means raising ambitiously the NDC targets from 25 to 2030, the critical 5 years now. We must, yes, reduce demand of fossil fuel, but we must also cut the supply of fossil fuel. And we must scale up significantly climate finance for the South so that they can leapfrog in part the carbon era. At present, the governments, of which the UK and the US, are producing the double amount of fossil fuels that is consistent with 1.5, double the amount. In 2024, 40% of the world's population votes. Every vote matters here with regard to 1.5 Celsius aligned energy policy. And even if the 1.5 threshold is passed during the 2030s, as seems likely, every fraction of a degree matters beyond 1.5. And therefore, again, every vote matters. So let me sum up. COP28 produced an international agreement. It was very formal, but is now up to our citizens this year, so the now is now politically, to give this agreement meaning. This will be a political struggle in an age of large geopolitical tension and further rises in populist politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. I'm now going to hand over to Trina, who's going to talk to us about loss and damage.
Thanks, Debbie. My name is Katrina Flesher, and I'm a PhD researcher in the School of Law and the School of Earth and Environment at Leeds, researching loss and damage. It's really wonderful to be joining all of you. Before I launch into my reflections about COP28 and loss and damage, I wanted to very briefly explain what we're kind of talking about when we speak about loss and damage, because it's quite a climate jargony sort of term. So in climate policy and advocacy, the impacts of climate change are described as loss and damage. That can be culture, livelihoods, infrastructure, most importantly, lives that are irretrievably lost or significantly damaged due to weather events caused by human-induced climate change. And anywhere in the world can experience loss and damages, but it's the global South, particularly small island developing states and least developed countries, who experience losses and damages most significantly. And yet those are the very countries who hold the least historical responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions, having burned a fraction of the fossil fuels responsible for anthropogenic climate change. And so loss and damage policy is intended to drive at that injustice, the fact that those least responsible for climate change are most impacted by it. And that's generally envisioned in terms of financial support and technical support flowing from the global north, the countries most responsible for climate change, towards the most impacted communities and countries in the global south. The global north has historically really resisted loss and damage policy, essentially for fear of being tied to financial liability for climate change. But after about 30 years of advocacy by groups from the Global South, particularly small island developing states, at COP27, so the COP prior to the one that we're talking about today, it was agreed that financial arrangements could be introduced for loss and damage. And then there were a series of transitional meetings which took place in 2022 and 23 to put into gear the fund arrangements for loss and damage. And so COP28 was enormously anticipated in the loss and damage community, you know, by far the most anticipated COP for loss and damage ever. And in a very unprecedented move, which I think surprised everyone, myself very much included, on the first day of COP28, the plans for the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund were announced. And that's the first time that like an agreement has ever been announced on the first day of a COP. They tend to kind of be really sort of like strung out in sort of brutal negotiations in the last few days. And that was a historic achievement. Even in 2021, many negotiators thought a loss and damage fund would always be impossible. So, you know, the achievement of that at COP28 was an enormously big deal. But there are two main reflections that I have on the loss and damage fund that I'd kind of like everyone to sort of take away, I suppose. The first is that the loss and damage fund is planned to be hosted by the World Bank. And that is a source of significant concern for most negotiators and activists from the Global South. Firstly, because the US has a significant influence on the World Bank. They tend to be instrumental in deciding the World Bank president. And the US is also historically by far the greatest opponent of loss and damage policy. And relatedly, the World Bank tends to rely on market-based approaches to dispersing money, so sort of loans and market-based disbursement mechanisms. And loans aren't really in the spirit of loss and damage. Indeed, it's, you know, spiraling into more debt is a really big threat for countries impacted by losses and damages from climate change. But additionally, like loss and damage policy is about justice and equity and solidarity. And I think a lot of negotiators from the Global South were concerned that the World Bank host doesn't quite achieve that. And the second reflection about the Loss and Damage Fund is essentially how sparse the funding is at the moment. Initial pledges were made throughout COP28. The UAE and Germany pledged $100 million each. The US unfortunately pledged only 17 million, which was also not new money, not additional money. It was just a sort of relabeling of existing money. And altogether, the Loss and Damage Fund has about 700 million US dollars sat in it right now, having been donated at COP28. That's not something to sniff at, but Global South negotiators had asked for $100 billion every year for losses and damages, which is itself... Almost there, yeah. Which is itself so much less than the 400 billion US dollars a year, which is expected in the cost of losses and damages from climate change. That also doesn't touch the side of those kind of like non-quantifiable impacts, like the losses of kind of cultures and lives. So it's not to take away from the enormity of what was achieved at COP28, which comes from decades of tireless work, particularly by activists from least developed countries and small island developing states. But it is to say that the financing facility as it exists at the moment isn't the sort of deliverance of climate justice, which a lot of people had hoped for. That's all from me. Thank you, Debbie.
Perfect, and bang on time. Thank you very much. Before I hand over to Susan, who's going to talk about the youth participation and agenda at COP, just a reminder to put any of your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, please. Okay, and Susan, please take the floor.
Thank you, Debbie. So good afternoon, I'm Susan Ann Samuel, second year PhD student at the University of Leeds, the School of Politics and International Studies. So we have been hearing from the panelists about how the COP28 was, and it's said to be, as it hit the headlines, that it was the beginning of the end for the fossil fuels. And the whole COP started on a positive note, as we just heard, with the loss and damage being operationalized. But so many caveats, so many things to think about. And as youth, we need to have a critical eye. And that's exactly what I'll be trying to unpack at this moment. So I was there at UA for the 2 weeks, and being there as one of the young people was very exciting. However, there were so many aspects that I'm still trying to grapple with, especially with respect to the youth movement. And as for the key outcomes and the reflections on what I thought about, I'm trying to tie it in 3 different points. So the first thing is about a thought on civic and democratic space, or the expression. How did it happen? What happened actually there? So the Dubai Consensus is a bit surreal, being championed by a petrostate, as we've heard it, with the presence of, as quoted by The Guardian, the lobbyists of oil and gas companies, with at least more than 2,400 fossil fuel lobbyists there, with more than 70,000 people attending the COP in person, and still striking a deal with enough and more wriggle room in the final cover text. All of this is very concerning. I would say the future depends on how we as youths adamantly steer ourselves forward, and our voices should sound the urgency of it. So COP28 exposed huge criticism on the limited civic and democratic space throughout the process, even after we saw an exponential rise in the youths coming as observers, negotiators, and advocates for the same. So how did it reflect on the textual reference in the final cover text? So reference of intergenerational equity just happened once. This is concerning after an overwhelming presence of the youth and their voices at COP. However, youth as in itself was mentioned thrice, and children 5 times, but the question remains, is this enough? I'm not sure, it's an open question. In the UA consensus outcomes, again, the presidency youth climate champion was institutionalized as one of the COP28 decisions, and is noteworthy where a roadmap of strategy to enhance participation in still education and embed action is hoping to increase. But through a critical lens, I would yet again pose the question of, are we doing enough? Has the deal struck enough? What is our agency in it as youths? Which brings me to the third point of international cooperation and what it means to youths. So again, we did hear from the previous panelists about the importance of cooperation, bringing solidarity, where the youths are tying in voices together. So what does that mean? The inclusion of international cooperation in the final text, again, and the ambit it creates for the succeeding COPs for the and the presence of youths in it is important. The very mention of it as a separate section is extremely positive note for multilateralism and diplomacy with respect to what we can push forward in the future. Now at hand, we have Azerbaijan, which is another petrostate holding the presidency for COP29. And it was just a few days after the conclusion of COP28 that we read the headlines again, how they constitute their summit committee with a major question of inclusion exposed. So we know how it was an all 28 male member constituency with no women. But does this, and it brings the question of, at such crossroads, now that was rectified, but at such crossroads, we again think where inclusion is confused to be yet another tick in the box, rather than a guiding factor for social welfare and justice across the globe, as we also progress for climate ambition. And we trying to bring the world together at one voice. And we need to think as youths on how to leverage this international cooperation so that it is not just a something to be said, but it is something actioned. So as youths, tying in these 3 points, I would just say, how is agency bolstered through civic and democratic expression? What's our role in it? Did COP do enough? The second is how our voices are being internalized. They should not just be heard and appreciated. Of course, it should be, but what goes beyond it? And the third is how it brings fresh perspectives of innovation, critical thought, and new hope for the people and the planet. So what does all this mean to University of Leeds? We are 37,000 more and more of students, and that means we have we need to bring more hope to this world, and we can do more. So as we go forward, as we push forward for COP29, every one of our voices matter, and how we get involved in the UNFCCC COP processes, what are the things that we can do, is all something that we have to think about. And that's it. Thank you, Debbie.
Thanks very much, Susan. We've got some time now for Q&A. So if everyone would like to have all panelists would like to have their cameras on. And we have a number of questions already submitted by the audience. If you do have more questions, feel free to add them into the Q&A box as we go along. But to start with, we do have a few questions on the Loss and Damage Fund. So I wondered, Trina, if you would be able to say a little bit more and explain how the fund might work and how the figure was arrived at.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Debbie. I think it was Alex's question about the where the 400 billion figure is from. It's from the Loss and Damage Collaboration, which is the kind of main global network of researchers, activists, and policymakers on loss and damage, and it kind of sits across all of those areas. So I think I can reply in the chat. I'll reply with the link to that report that they produced, which arrived at the 400 billion figure. And it's very much a kind of collaboration of like research work and academia and policy. On non-economic losses and damages and how they can be addressed within the governance framework, I think it's an excellent question. And it's really illustrative of the fact that like financing alone is insufficient for loss and damage. When we're talking about like the loss of biodiversity and cultures and languages and lives, there is no way for a financial mechanism alone to address those or recognize those kind of irreparable losses. And so I think that the question of non-economic loss and damage, like I say, illustrates the fact that loss and damage is bigger than financing. It's also about like the empowerment of vulnerable people, the kind of like holistic addressing of what creates vulnerability to climate change, which is often the marginalization of people within the countries they live. And so I think that actually one of the best ways that non-economic loss and damage can be recognized and addressed and kind of built into its governance mechanisms is through more participatory structures in the Loss and Damage Fund. So that's something that kind of on the road ahead to the intersessionals in Bonn and COP29, a lot of civil society activists want to see most impacted communities, civil society groups heard in the loss and damage governance. There being a allotted recognized space for them in how funding is allocated, but also the kind of more political and holistic kind of programs which are put in place to work with and empower the most vulnerable communities. And so I think really making sure those voices are platformed in the loss and damage governance is kind of the key to that.
That's great, thank you. A very comprehensive answer as well. Thanks ever so much. So I can see in the chat as well, there's a few questions around making COP29 more representative and also how young people and students can influence decision making. So Susan, would you be able to give us a few thoughts on that? And perhaps Richard, you'd like to come in as well afterwards to talk about how this might be enacted at the university itself.
Of course, thanks, Debbie. Yes, so I would say, like, as I've said earlier, like our students having so much of the potential to make a change is in itself the wealth, and that we as 37,000 and more students here in the University of Leeds, it's a social capital we should make use of as much as possible. And as for, so I'm also the student representative for UNFCCC Task Force. So I would say there are pathways that we are trying and building for youth engagement in the university. So there will be more to stay informed, and to comment more on the technicalities, I'm not sure. So someone else in the panel, but perhaps Professor Richard, can you step in?
Yes, thank you, Simon. I mean, on that question, we do have the UNFCCC task force at the University of Leeds, as Susan's saying, and she's on that task force with others of us. We are in a process of looking at ways in which we as a university can have more impact on the COP, all the while aware that, again, there are two sides to COP. There is the negotiating process, and there it's a question of impact on the negotiating teams. And we're looking at how we can do that, both with regard to the UK and their peers, and the climate scientists have important things to say, and the peers being in the UK Climate Committee has also close relations with the negotiating team of the UK, and we can gradually perhaps influence more the ways in which they set their policy, as was partly indicated in what was said earlier. We can also have an influence with regard to other negotiating teams, again, within the part of COP that is the negotiating process that ends up with the final decision text. And I think particularly of negotiating teams in Africa, where they don't have enough advice to be able to, as a small delegation team, to basically have an effective voice within the negotiating process. So both with regards to, in a sense, this country, but also with regards to us helping more vulnerable countries that have less of a voice within the negotiating process in, for example, Africa, but also parts of Asia and Latin America. With regard to the other part of COP, which is, in a sense, the World Trade Fair, and there are a lot of things going on there. We are working to see what effects can we have with other NGOs, on basic energy strategies, water strategies, agricultural strategies, food system strategies. There's an awful lot that is going on that doesn't end up in the negotiating process itself, although that negotiating process frames all these activities, where we can have direct effect through our research and through our education, and again, across generations. There's a lot to do. There's a lot for us to synthesize, but I do believe in the coming years, we will be able to have more effect as the negotiations become more and more important. But direct effect on the negotiating process itself, that is something that we need to consider very carefully, because we can only do a certain amount, but we will look to the pathways, as I suggested earlier, with the climate scientists particularly, to do that. I hope that that gives you a sense of what we're doing, and I will certainly, with the other members of the team, and with my co-chair, Jason Lower, climate scientist in the Priestley Centre, we will be communicating as much as possible about what we're doing, so that you can get involved, and that you can feel that Leeds University and the Priestley Centre working for Leeds University is able to get you involved in the way that you want. So these are really important questions, and we are on them, and you will hear from me and others more in the coming weeks and months. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Richard. And we will follow up with people after this webinar on how to get further involved in the UNFCCC process as well. There are quite a few questions coming up in the Q&A about the fossil fuel lobby and the presence of the fossil fuel executives at COP28. And I know that's also going to be a big issue at COP29 in Azerbaijan. So from your different perspectives, would anyone like to come in and comment on their thoughts on the number of fossil fuel delegates who were at COP28 and the role that they may have played in affecting the topics that you are following? Go for it, Piers.
Yeah, perhaps I can kind of begin. Yeah, I absolutely think this is a kind of double-edged sword in the same way. The first thing is because they are such a big constituency, and they of course have a lot of kind of capital and influence. I think it's very important they are fair, and I think if they aren't in the room at all, the whole COP project will be completely ignored by the wider crowd in some way and kind of corporate society. So I think they have to be there. And slightly give the kind of UAE credit in fact they're at the kind of crossroads, but they're one of the OPEC countries, but they have some of the more kind of progressive countries at their allies, and they're importantly on good relationship with India and China. So in fact, they were definitely one of the countries I think that did a good job really trying to bring all those sides together, and I think they were generally ambitious, and I think that wording on the transition I talked about is absolutely, they're one of the few countries that perhaps have the kind of credibility to try and get such ambitious wording. And I was going to say too that, I mean, I think we talked to them, nearly every constituency thinks they're underrepresented. Is that industry to think they've been underrepresented at COPs. And if one of the arguments coming from a petro state like Saudi Arabia, directly say, because they have one of the youngest population with a lot of under 18s, they in fact ought to be a really powerful voice within the discussions. So what I think I'm trying to say, sorry, I'm talking too much, Debbie, but I think somehow we have to find a good way to try and include everyone, every constituency in some way, and of course in the optimum, but I think we are definitely going in that direction, and we had over 100,000 people, kind of far more than any others. So there was plenty of representation there.
Thank you. And not wanting to put Susan or Trina on the spot, do you have anything to add in terms of the fossil fuel lobby being at COP28 in terms of the topics that you're covering?
Susan, I'll go first quickly, if that's all right. I have a thought in my mind and I'm scared it's going to escape. I think that something that's worth thinking about in terms of the fossil fuel lobby representation is kind of the proportionality of who's there. As Piers says, like, because, you know, to get fossil fuels on the agenda and to speak about them in the kind of powerful way that COP28 inched towards, it seems natural that the fossil fuel lobby are going to make themselves known there and are going to be there. And I mean, it's going to be the case at Azerbaijan as well, as Susan was saying, another petro state. I think a lot of the issues come at the disproportionate presence of the fossil fuel lobby. And I think that for a lot of people who are most impacted by climate change, just thinking about it in the kind of loss and damage terms, quite a lot of bureaucratic difficulties really restrict access to COPs. Sort of like the ability to get visas, have the funding, have somewhere to stay. And that's something that for like activist groups and advocacy groups is much more difficult to kind of get those voices of people who are most impacted by climate change to the conference versus the kind of slick machine of the oil companies. And so I think that it's definitely noticeable in the increasing presence of impacted communities at COPs, and it is, as I say, the advocacy of those communities that led to the loss and damage outcome, which was one of the the major achievements of the conference. But I think that there's certainly an immense amount of work to be done in making sure that who is at the conferences is significantly representative of who is experiencing climate change, because they can best speak to what climate change means to them and how it can best be addressed. Yeah.
Thank you, and that covers touched on a range of issues that have also come up in the Q&A about inclusion and so on. Susan, have you got anything that you want to add as well?
Well, I just want to add to what Katrina has said about like when there's obstacle or like of lobbying happening. There's also it reminds me of my research of norms, in which we state about it as norm entrepreneurs, which means like there is something happening, but then when it's blocked, then you get to devise ways in which you overcome it. So it's kind of like also we do anticipate lobbying always. So and as youths, like for the youth involvement, the best ways possible is of innovation and fresh perspectives. So that brings a huge force of talking against it or like working for what we know is right. So yeah.
Thank you, Susan. And I'm just going to squeeze in one more question. Richard, there's a question here about the crucial year of elections and the role of citizens. Could you just give us a very quick answer to what citizens can do to signal change?
Well, very quickly, what they can do to signal change. I think I saw Christina's question. I think it is a question of pressure from citizens towards governments. Governments are dragging their feet. We're also entering in a very turbulent moment with regard to the right-wing weaponization of climate change. We all know that. So it's a question of basically voting for, in principle, 1.5 Celsius energy aligned energy policy. And that means, for example, in this country, being very clear that the 28 billion pledge by the Labour Party remains very important, and the pressure should be put by all citizens on the Labour Party that it doesn't water it down, because it is that kind of pledge, and its implementation that allows us to think of an ambitious energy policy that goes back to all that we've been saying about what comes out of COP28. So I think it's pressure from citizens on governments that is going to be very important this year, and it's going to be a struggle because many other citizens are going to vote in a different way.
Perfect. Thank you, Richard. And that's a great thing to keep in our minds as we go through the year. So we're going to move on now and have a think about COP29. So there should be a slide appearing very shortly. We can talk about the road to COP29. So just briefly, I think it's really important to remember that COPs aren't just a one-off annual event every year. They're the culmination of a year-long process. And again, each COP builds on the COPs that have come before them and the cycles they're in. So these are just a few of the key points to look out for throughout 2024. So in June, there will be the Bonn Climate Conference in Germany, also known as the Intersessionals. So this is where governments, countries come together 6 months before COP, 6 months after the previous COP, to assess progress on the commitments made and also to lay groundwork for the COP that will come up in December. It's sort of framed as a mini COP. It's a great place to go if you get the opportunity to engage with the UNFCCC, to follow some of the negotiations that are happening and the topics being covered as well. Regional climate weeks as well happen towards the end of the summer and the autumn. You can see that they cover 4 of the main regions represented in the UNFCCC talks. And again, this is where stakeholders and governments come together to talk about plans for COP, assess progress as well. For both of these events, many of the side events and talks, press conferences are often live streamed or recorded. So please do sort of look out and see about what's being talked in those. There's also a number of non-UNFCCC events that can be really relevant. One example, and one example only, New York Climate Week, which happens in the autumn as well, is often a place where stakeholders who are going to COP, governments as well, high-level representatives come together to talk about many of the issues that will be raised. It's a great place to find out what's going to be talked about. And again, you don't actually have to be in New York. Many of the events are live streamed, and it's really interesting to find out the hot topics and what people are saying about them as well. But on top of that, it's not just about events. The UNFCCC is working throughout the year. There are meetings, there are committees and work streams going on throughout 2024. And often many of them have opportunities to contribute, or they have calls for evidence. Some of these are fairly impenetrable to work out what they actually want, but we're working within the University of Leeds to make that process easier for people to engage with. So do watch this space, and hopefully that will be something that people can become much more involved with in the near future. Having said that, so that's just given a brief overview of some of the things that will be happening in the run-up to COP29. But in following that, I'd just like to invite all of our panellists to give us, say, 1 minute on what they think will be happening or should be happening regarding the topics that they've presented here on the way to COP29, what they'd like to see as well. Okay, so Susan, would you like to go first? We'll go in reverse order from the last time.
Of course, I would say more courage on whatever that we have to do. So like don't be afraid of what you can give, and to get involved in whatever way possible, explore, be informed, and be aware that your agency and what you can do as youths is important. So yeah, that's it.
That's great. Trina, go ahead.
Lovely. Yeah, I think so. The next few months are really important for the Loss and Damage Fund, as I was saying. And I think that the key things that would be really important to see in the next few months would be participatory governance structures in the Loss and Damage Fund governance. As I mentioned in the Q&A earlier, civil society involvement, community definitions of what is needed to address loss and damage. The Loss and Damage Fund should start defining what its money is going to look like, and that should look like grants, not loans. And access to that fund, who has a right to ask for money for loss and damage funding, is going to be a really fraught question over the next few months. And I think it's really important that access to that fund is understood to be needs-based and flexible, not restrictive to particular categories, but really responsive to what countries in the global south impacted by climate change are kind of asking for. And I think that continuing to look for the justice questions that exist in climate policy, and listening to civil society activists from the global south. There are 100 organizations out there, hundreds and endless ones, that we can listen to and platform in our own work. And I think that going forward, all of those things are important at the top level of the UNFCCC, but also just in our lives as like activists and researchers and people interested in climate change.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Trina. Richard, would you like to come in on the political road to COP29 if you have anything further to add to what you said before?
Just a couple of things, Debbie. I think we should all remember the COP process. It's a slow process. It goes back to some of the questions. Why isn't there disagreement? It's a slow process because there are almost 200 countries involved. Yeah, to try and get an agreement. That's why, going back to what Piers said right at the beginning and that I reiterated, that it was a success to get to something like transition of fossil fuels, even though the wording is looser and more vague than phasing out, and there isn't a schedule. But for 200 countries, or circa 200 countries, to get to that point within a COP meeting is a success at the level of climate diplomacy. Of course, it's too slow, but many other things happen apart from the COP process, and we must always remember that. And the economic reality is accelerating towards renewables. So within the COP process and COP29, Debbie, I think the next step is the next bit. How can we get further meat on the transition? Can we begin to get to a schedule? But I think critical within all this, and what did fail at COP28, is this question of scaling up climate finance. And that must be a priority, both within the North and between the North, more importantly in the South. That must be with regard to adaptation, loss and damage, and mitigation. Yeah, it must be a priority. And I think a lot of work will go towards that being much more of a priority than it ended up being at COP28.
Super. Thank you, Richard. And Piers, given that we've now taken stock with the global stocktake, sorry, I'm
do jump in.
A specific question. So we've taken stock by the global stocktake, and we know that we're off track. So what do we do next as a global society?
Yeah, that's interesting, Debbie, and I really agree with what everyone else talked about. The first thing is to absolutely say, I think the COP is only kind of words, their kind of annual kind of words, and to really empower those words, we have to try and make sure our national and international institutions do take those words and turn them into concrete actions. And this, I guess, a good kind of segue in what we do is a kind of climate change committee job, and the way that it works in the country. We're about the climate change committee. We're going to produce our recommendation from the outcome of COP at the end of January, and then we're producing the net carbon budget work in the beginning of the end of this here, and that can recommend we increase our NDC target and increase our NDC commitment and to describe a new pathway for this country. But what we have to make sure that this kind of governance is supported internationally, and that the countries and sector of the economy do really find out ways to really track ambition and track progress over time and to track actionable things to do, and the organizations and institutions that do keep countries to account. So we are delivering on the actions, and which it talked about so importantly, the kind of financing, which is always so far behind where it should be, and I think, you know, we struggle with these big international institutions now. The whole international world not in a good place to make them work. So I think we can use other things. We can use sectors of company. We can use communities of different types around the world to try and really keep the system going between the COP conferences. Sorry, Debbie, I didn't answer your question probably, but
That's absolutely fine. I landed it on you without any preparation, so that's okay. So thank you, everybody. Just a few closing remarks, that things that have just stuck in my mind. So particularly from Susan. Susan said that we will have agency and we need more courage and to get involved. And I think that's really key messages to take away from today. Trina, you mentioned about listening to others and making sure that we give them a platform as well, something that we should bear in mind as a university, and how we can enable others to participate further in the UNFCCC process and have a voice. And again, Richard and Piers were talking about holding people, organisations to account as well, and keeping that in mind as we go through the year. So thank you ever so much to everybody who's spoken today, and thank you all, audience, for all your questions and your interest in COP28 and hopefully in COP29 as well as we move forward. We'll be sharing the recording on the Priestley website very soon, so please do revisit. And also we will be in touch very shortly, hopefully, with more information about how you can engage with the UNFCCC process, and we will keep, as a university, working on that to make sure that more people can be informed and involved as well. So thanks very much, everybody, and we hope to be in touch and see you soon. Thank you and goodbye.